Welcome to another live episode of the Julian Dorey, live series. This isn't the podcast, but we are going through and breaking down what has happened this week on a Sunday night. We've done a couple of these now. They've been popular, so we're going to keep them rolling. I don't know if Sunday night's going to be the night we're doing it forever, but we'll get it there. So for all of you out there, if you can share this around with your friends when you see it, it would be a huge, huge help because currently YouTube does only show it to our subscribers. It does not go to any non-subscribers. It's like 2 or 3%. But if you happen to be a non-subscriber right now on the video, please smash that subscribe button. Everybody else, please smash that like button. All of that is a huge, huge help on this. And let's get rolling because we have a lot to get to tonight. So we're going to talk all about the Venezuelan election crisis, which is a mess. I mean, everybody's wrong. Let's just get that out there. Everybody's wrong in this situation. We're going to break down why and where this might go. And I really want to get into the nitty gritty on that. So we're going to go through that. We're going to go through my favorite governor in the history of the United States of America. Just the best fucking guy to ever exist because he is the gift that keeps on giving. The most shameless, absolute flip-flopper and liar I've ever seen in my life. The great Gavin Newsom. We're going to talk about his homeless legislation, which is just, wow, what a turn. What a turn. What a turn, Gavin. We're going to get there. We are also going to talk all about the UK riots, which is a very interesting situation going on. If you have not seen what's happening across a lot of different cities in the UK, including Leeds and Manchester and a whole bunch of other stuff, a whole bunch of other places because of basically a recent tragedy that occurred, and we'll get into all that and explain what's going on. And then hopefully we're going to get to some Kamala Trump as well. There were a lot of fireworks this week. That's what it's doing. But I see everyone down in the chat. Like I said in the last couple, I really got to focus on this while I'm doing it. I'll check your chats later, so feel free to talk among yourselves in there. Give some feedback and hit me in the comment section if you're watching this after the live. But let's get right to it with Venezuela. So I really want to start from a historical standpoint so that people understand what's going on, like where Venezuela went into the current political structure that they have and what it means today with their election. So just before we do that, for a little background on a high level, we're going to come back to this, but there was a recent election between Nicolas Maduro and the opposition party, the right wing. It was on July 28th. Immediately, the results were disputed. Maduro's CNE, which is essentially his Bureau of Elections that is completely friendly to him, was calling the election in his favor by like 7 or 8%. You know, the country's at a 90% poverty rate. It's been controlled by Maduro, who is a dictator, and it's been under dictator control, including Hugo Chavez, his predecessor, since 1999. So there's a lot going on here. And yes, there are United States intelligence type actions that have occurred across the 25 years that they have been communists that, you know, make it interesting as far as who really won this election and who's, more importantly, who's saying won this election. So I'm going to get into that, but it's very strange because the opposition leader, what the hell was her name? I don't want to fuck that up. Marina Corina Machado was elected by, I think, like 13 different constituency parties that came together to form one opposition to get Maduro out of there, the socialist leader who a lot of people think is communist and he's a dictator. And in June, Maduro's government banned her from then running after she was called that candidate. So the whole thing stinks, but we really got to go back to the beginning to understand this. So 1999, Hugo Chavez takes over Venezuela. Venezuela before 99 was, call it a Western, trading partner of the United States and other countries in that ally range. And, the 500-pound elephant in the room with the country is that they have significant oil reserves. If you actually look today in 2023, they had the most oil reserves in the world in Venezuela, which is a small country on the northern part of South America. So you can imagine the economic interest that the West and pretty much every other fucking country has in this place. So 1999, Chavez wins an election. And, Chavez's rise to power is very, very interesting because he tried a coup in 1992. It failed. He was thrown into prison. And when he was released from prison in 1994, he went on this, 4 or 5 year campaign, not just across his country, but across other South American countries, including Cuba and Colombia, forming ties with other strongman leaders and basically building his political presence to what would be, it was the 99 presidential election. Maybe it was 98 for him to go into power in 99, but either way, for that election at the end of the 90s, which if you look at it, obviously Chavez came at it from a left-wing perspective, but if you look at that history, it's very, very similar to, say, like an Adolf Hitler type rise. Hitler tries the beer hall push in, I believe, 1923, doesn't have enough support. They try to overtake the government and it doesn't work. He gets thrown in prison, gets to put on a whole show during his trial, writes Mein Kampf while he's in prison, comes out, gets his power together for about 4 or 5 years, 6 years. Great Depression happens, starts to take control. The rest is history. Obviously, Venezuela has not seen anywhere near the type of power that Hitler was able to amass once he got to power, but the pattern is somewhat similar. So Chavez comes into power. 3 years later is where it gets really, really interesting. So in 2002, a bunch of different not right-wing groups necessarily, but a bunch of different groups who didn't like Chavez, which included the military aspects of the military, some social groups, a bunch of Catholic groups. And by the way, thank you for all the likes, everyone. Please keep that going. I see you guys ripping up the chat. Let's keep that rolling. But a bunch of these different groups kind of came together and formed these alliances and decided, you know what, it's time for Chavez to go. Or so you would think. You would think that was just like a normal, oh yeah, all these groups are coming together and forming this because they're friends and they want to change the government. Speculation there is that there was a little some behind that, if you know what I mean. Chavez's approval ratings had allegedly gone down to around 30%, and there's reason to believe that that was pretty true. And he was this socialist dictator, pretty much communist. He might deny that, but he pretty much was. And so, yes, there's going to be natural inclinations to come up against him. But the reason that it was so organized is most likely because the United States intelligence services had interest in putting those aforementioned groups, the military aspects of the military, the Catholic groups, other social groups, and anti-Chavez type groups together to form this alliance and cause chaos around the country in an attempt to overthrow him. Now, why would the U.S. want that? I mean, it's pretty obvious. Number one, like I said, you're talking about a communist. In what world has the United States government, let alone the intelligence services, ever liked the communist leader around the world? Pretty much never. So, of course, they want to get this guy out of there. Secondly, he's sitting on a lot of fucking oil. And they'd love to get access to that oil. They'd love to be able to control that trade because just like when Cuba got taken over in 59 in the revolution and Cuba, the great moneymaker under Batista, fell out of, U.S. economic interests, so did Venezuela and the very beautiful oil reserves that they have below them. So the United States had a reason to, maybe play under the table to get a little military intelligence in there to take this guy out. To see it from their perspective, though, again, I'm not saying I want to be a part of supporting my government overthrowing a bunch of other fucking governments and people. I think that's kind of a bad precedent, but I recognize the world's a fucked up place and weird shit happens. To look at it from their perspective, though, they're not wrong at all about who Chavez was. So in 1999, when he came in, I'm going to read these straight off the notes. You can get this on Wikipedia right here. But in 1999, April 1999, shortly after he came in, the guy formed a new constitution. Essentially, he called a national referendum where the question being whether to create an elected assembly to draw up the new constitution of Venezuela was discussed. The result of the referendum was 71.8% in favor. Consequently, in July 1999, elections were held to choose delegates to the assembly. In these elections, Chavez's slate of candidates received 52% of the vote, but won 95% of the seats, 125 of the 131 seats due to the voting procedures decided by the government beforehand, meaning he rigged the vote. 54% of the eligible electorate also did not vote, which points to voter suppression, intimidation, the whole bit. It's exactly what it looks like. Furthermore, that wasn't enough. We look at a lot of dictators around the world, and we know one thing they do is they get control of the judiciary so that they become the judiciary. That's exactly what he did. In mid-August 1999, the Constitutional Assembly moved to restructure the nation's judiciary, giving itself the power to fire judges, seeking to expedite the investigations of corruption outstanding against what the New York Times estimated was nearly all of the nation's 4,700 judges, clerks, and bailiffs, even the bailiffs. On 23rd August, the Supreme Court voted 8-6 that the Assembly was not acting unconstitutionally in assuming those powers. However, the next day, Cecilia Sosa Gomez resigned in protest. Over 190 judges were eventually suspended on charges of corruption. Eventually, the Supreme Court was also dissolved, and new judges were appointed by who were supporters of Chavez. So the guy's filling up the entire judiciary with his people, the whole government with his people, and is taking complete and total control. Now, 2002 fails. He was also taken out of power for like 47 hours. It was like, there's documentaries on it, but it was this whole thing. He comes back into power, gets enough support from the military, tamps it down, and takes full control that he would maintain until 2013 when he died of cancer and some other things. In the middle of all that, if you look at Venezuela's GDP, they had this big bump in GDP, and I want to say it was 2006. I hope I'm right about that. 2005, something like that. Boom, boom, boom. Where was this? Bear with me. I had this chart, but I might have lost it because my computer crashed right when we were coming on, and I might have lost it. Either way, the GDP went way up in like 05, 06, and then steadily declined. I don't know enough details about this. Maybe people in the comments can help us out, but it kind of looks like a China, misreporting GDP to pump up the government type deal, because it was a one-hit wonder and then crashed all the way into what would end up being the 2015 sanctions, which I'll come to in a minute. So in Chavez's final years, he did continue to make alliances with Marxist elements, with guerrilla elements within Colombia and other neighboring countries. So naturally, we know the United States and intelligence has got to be involved in this type of situation and monitoring that, because again, CIA has never liked Marxists. We're going to be having a guy in here in the fall who every time he shows up at a country, somehow the government, overturns itself. And usually it's Marxist elements. And so I think that's probably fair to say. And this guy was one of the most, if not the most well-entrenched, CIA asset in South America, maybe ever. So we'll definitely be talking to him about that. But Chavez makes all these alliances, does his thing. He's friends with Cuba, all these different places. Then he dies, and Nicolas Maduro takes over. Now, Maduro was the son of, I believe, a union guy. He grew up, his mother was born like right on the edge of Colombia, and he grew up in Venezuela and had leftward leanings. It's kind of funny. The guy's going to end up becoming a total autocrat and dictator and torturer in chief when he gets to power. But I read up that my dude loved John Lennon and Led Zeppelin, so I can't hate him on that. That's some good shit right there. But anyway, so he takes power when Chavez croaks, and this is where Venezuela starts to really step up the overt nature of their relationships around the world. Obviously, there had been these relationships I just laid out with other dictators that Hugo Chavez had formed, including with like Muammar Gaddafi, who died before Chavez in Libya, but a bunch of those different guys. Maduro kind of takes that to the statesman level. He had been involved in, I think he was like the foreign affairs minister. Don't quote me on that, but he had been forming alliances around the world on behalf of Chavez's government when he was, when he was working for Chavez. So he assumes office, and over the next 8 years, cozies up to countries including China, Russia, and to an extent Saudi Arabia. The Saudi Arabia one I'm still a little unclear on. He ended up having an official state visit in Saudi Arabia during the MBS era once that had started, but I don't know the extent of the ties there. Obviously, oil nation, but he's a guy who cozied up to China and Russia to try to get support for his country, Venezuela, to potentially join the BRIC nation, the BRICS, BRICS, which Andy Bustamante talks about a lot because that's a rising economic power and certainly something interesting for the Western currency world to look out for. But he wanted the support of China on that, and he had developed a relationship with Putin before he took office and continued that. And it's also kind of interesting because Putin is right wing and Maduro's left wing. But I always talk about politics being a circle. It's a pretty good example. Dictators love dictators in a lot of cases, not always, but they seem to get along just fine. So these are the kinds of things that the United States obviously is not going to like to see. They don't want to see a guy who is forming alliances with the countries that they view as their enemies or, long-term adversaries, however you want to say it. And what they really don't want to see is a leader who maybe even takes things a step farther than Chavez even did from a human rights perspective. And to that, I will go to Wikipedia right here for the part about some of Maduro's human rights record. Maduro heads an authoritarian government and has been described as an autocrat and dictator. Yeah, no shit. Between 2013 and 2023, Venezuela dropped 42 places in the Press Freedom Index. According to estimations by the United Nations and Human Rights Watch, under Maduro's administration, more than 20,000 people have been subject to extrajudicial killings, and 7 million Venezuelans have been forced to flee the country. The UN fact-finding mission on Venezuela concluded that the country's justice system independence has been deeply eroded. The mission also identified frequent due process violations, including political external interference and the admission of evidence through torture. Most Venezuelan television channels are controlled by the state, and information unfavorable to the government is not covered completely. In 2018, a board of independent experts designated by the Organization of American States alleges that crimes against humanity have been committed in Venezuela during Maduro's presidency. In 2021, the Office of the Prosecutor of the ICC announced they were opening an investigation regarding the situation in the country. So the guy absolutely tortures his own citizens, absolutely leads with complete power. I understand that sometimes people think that organizations like this can be influenced by, say, other intelligence interests who want to see someone like this taken out. I'm not saying that doesn't happen. I'm not saying that didn't happen. To some extent, it definitely did. Perhaps some things are exaggerated, but the guy it's without question, has been a dictatorial maniac who rules with an iron fist over a country that has around a 90% rate of the population living below the poverty line. This is a country that has also become a massive narco trafficking hub. It has become a massive hub for gangs. And as you're going to hear from Jorge Ventura, who is a border reporter I just spoke with, episode coming out next week, there are enormous problems right now with a gang called Tren de Aragua making their way into the United States across the border because the situation's also so fucking crazy in Venezuela that even they want to get out of there. So it's not like the guy hasn't overseen some massive issues. He also, by the way, has allowed his country to be ahead and perhaps even be in some ways silently allied with terrorist groups like Hezbollah, who run trafficking operations through Venezuela. And I got to tell you, they're not doing that without Maduro's permission. So we have also seen him continue, as I said, to make those alliances around the world. The U.S. obviously has a government that is pro-Israel. Maduro is not for Israel. So that's just another issue I'm sure that a lot of the United States leadership has with him. But 2015 is where shit got real. And that's because in 2015, sanctions were put in by the Obama administration in a heavy manner against Maduro and Venezuela. So these sanctions were economic and politically personal. I'll explain the second part in a minute. Economically, to really simplify it without getting into the nitty-gritty and getting myself in trouble for getting shit wrong, they severely limited trade with the United States and other Western allies, which of course includes oil, in an effort to bleed out the GDP and, in some fairness to Maduro, contribute to a growing poverty line. So perhaps, and I would venture to say for sure, if the United States had not done these sanctions in 2015, his poverty line would not be at 90. Would it probably be at, I don't know, 70, 75 and be fucking terrible? Yes. But 90, probably not. So they put in all these sanctions on the oil, which kills them economically. Then they also sanction a lot of the politicians, including Maduro. I just read that Maduro obviously has had investigations open for him in the ICC and in some international waters, I guess you could say. But the United States came out and basically said a lot of his government could not travel to the US, to allied countries, to I think even some South American countries that some way they forced. The United States use influence to say, don't let these people travel there. So it's like we're trying to shut off Venezuela from the world. Not all that different than we've done with Cuba for the most part since Castro took over in 59. So it's a very, very similar dance there. Again, coming back to the who's right and who's wrong. Is the United States perhaps motivated by monetary interests and some form of imperialism to get control of Venezuela's oil and perhaps get someone in there who is an asset in a way, a figurehead who is supported by United States intelligence, therefore the bureaucracy? Sure. If you wanted to look at that from a non-United States-centric perspective, someone of the world who wants to see everyone coexist and countries, police themselves, you might not like that. However, is the leadership there objectively bad and bad for the citizens? Yes. Furthermore, would you like to start a war with Venezuela? Absolutely fucking not. So if the intelligence communities are looking at this like, well, if we do some puppet power tree, make up a word right there, little economic influence to get this thing where we want to go, we don't put boots on the ground and we get what we want. So it's dirty on both ends. There's no doubt about that. But after 2015, there was a real line in the sand, and Maduro had to now face his people who, it's not like he put the sanctions in place, but because the sanctions were happening under his watch, he's getting some political heat for that. And the seat below him gets a little hotter, despite the fact that he is a dictator and controls a lot. It gets a little bit untenable when people are having trouble fucking eating at home. So there's an election in 2018, a few years after the sanctions, and I forget what it was, but essentially he ran against little to no opposition, wins the election. Of course, Maduro controls what the election's results are and the people who are reading off the election results. But he wins the election, and then something really weird happens. Donald Trump, who's now president and is a guy who has questioned, let's say, the power and foreign policy acting of the intelligence community, very happily puts on a pedestal this guy whose name I am forgetting right now. What the hell was his name? He puts on a pedestal this guy who didn't even run in 2018, and Juan Guaido. I definitely said that wrong, so correct me in the comments. But Juan Guaido, who effectively didn't run in 2018, but in maybe it was 2017, whatever it was, within a year, he says, "Oh no, I'm the rightful president." So from 2019 to 2023, the United States just in their on their State Department sheets, recognized this Juan Guaido as the president, had him as the person in control of some of these oil companies that, they had sanctioned. And, Trump was dancing him around the Oval Office and presenting him as the rightful president of Venezuela, which is, let's just call it what it is. It's all an act. He had absolutely no power. Maduro was completely in control. It's truly one of the most bizarre situations I've ever personally seen, but it's like a show trial, another form of that in a way. So the US basically has the outsider president who is doing kind of exactly what the intelligence community wants him to do, which is something that, like, if you look at Trump's record from 2017 to 2021 as president, it's a real mixed bag in that department. There were times where he was like the guy who was like at war with the deep state and the government bureaucracy. And then there were times where he's like, fuck yeah, what you guys are saying, let's do that. So this was one of those times where he's kind of like in the fuck yeah team. So this guy's like the fake president in the eyes of the US, but Maduro keeps running the country. Like I said, poverty line gets to 90% by 2023. Shit is bad. And now we're back to where I began this conversation, which is all the opposition parties kind of band together and they put their name behind this Maria Corina Machado lady before she is then banned by the government controlled by Maduro from running in the election on July 28th, 2024. So it ends up being Edmundo Gonzalez, who had the full backing of Maria Corina Machado, running in this election. And this is where we get to the present day where shit is weird. So in the build up to the election, the opposition party had said they would only accept the results of the election if they won. Now, that's a dangerous thing to say. Where we heard that one before. It's not to say that, like, Maduro doesn't clearly have a real popularity problem in Venezuela. It's not to say that he doesn't have corrupt government forces completely in his control who can sway an election and, potentially offset a popularity problem like that. But to go into an election saying that repeatedly, that we will only accept an outcome where we win, that kind of hurts you with your PR argument on the other side of the election when you lose, because people can say, well, you were going to say that anyway. Not really sure why they had that messaging, but they did. Nonetheless, the results get weird. So the way I understand it is that Venezuela, and please correct this in the comments if some of this information is not fully correct, but Venezuela essentially has a voting system where there is an electronic vote and effectively like a physical receipt for the vote that is cast. And they also have exit polling. More on that in a second, but on who's doing that. But election goes through on July 28th, and the exit polling shows massive anti-Maduro numbers, where the results start to come in the night, showing a Maduro victory by like 6 or 7%. Now, there were some reports that, the total added up to over 100%. It was like 110%, meaning Maduro cooked the books like in a very obvious way. The way I understand it is that turned out to not be true. They did have technically a whole number. Doesn't mean there wasn't fraud, but they didn't report like 110%. If there's some data that shows that that is not the case, please put that in the comment section or in the chat. And by the way, thank you to 132 people who have liked, and thank you to anyone who has tipped on this to help to support the show. Please keep those likes coming and smash that subscribe button as well. It is a huge help. It allows us to keep going. I'm going to talk about what we have coming up in a couple days, by the way, at some point, which is fucking wild. So anyway, Maduro wins 51% to like 44%. And basically in the middle of the night, before you can even say the election is known what the outcome is, Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State in the United States, comes out and already says that he has problems with the election's integrity, which is interesting because that's like the same thing that they yelled at Trump for doing at the same time here, albeit this is a communist country. I just found that a little bit ironic, but it kind of felt like, and I saw a great video from Jimmy Dorey on this, on his channel. I forget who the reporter he was. He had the video he was playing, but it felt like they were like prepared in the United States to say that. They wanted to put pressure on the situation. So Maduro's government then goes into overdrive mode. They start pushing out any opposition as far as like, they're not letting audits happen, or they say audits are going to happen and then they don't. They claim they didn't happen because there was a hack from Northern Macedonia, or like bunch of the fucking hacks around the world allegedly come from. And he starts going into full scale war with the West, with the media, saying there are interests in having him removed from power, which he is right about that. But he was using that automatically as a crutch to say, so I must have won this election, which is not necessarily true. The guy even went as far as to say that Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, all these guys were actually backed by the NSA and CIA, were given the technology they had and use it on behalf of the government and all this stuff. Like, he went full blown conspiracy in his press conference. Not to say government doesn't have some sort of role in these different platforms. We've certainly had a lot of questions and evidence on that, but he's just saying it completely off the cuff, and also getting into a war of words with Elon. I didn't even see this, but I want to say there was like some sort of like offering up a boxing match or some shit, some crazy shit like that with Elon. Like, you never know with the meme game these days. But, the guy also had some people that appear to be like useful idiots down there, I guess, throwing him lob up questions. I saw that guy, Jackson Hinkle, who I really got to look into more, but this is a dude who's blown up on Twitter a lot over the last year, who is kind of a strange figure. Like, he really blew up with the whole Gaza war and putting out a lot of information before it was checked on that. I'm not saying he got everything wrong, but there was stuff that he put out that was then objectively wrong. And he had these weird, like, online, like, alliances in a way. Yet he then formed something, I think this is real, something called like the American Communist Party. Like, he's a weird figure. So I guess if he's forming something called the American Communist Party, he's down there talking to a communist leader. This is someone he likes. Mind you, Jackson's another guy who seems to like Putin, right wing, very interesting. But he's lobbing up questions to Maduro for him to be able to put out these narratives, say what he wants to say, and go from there. And now we're at a point where the United States and some Western powers are trying to put pressure on Maduro to cede power. And there are all kinds of riots and uprisings within Venezuela occurring from the opposition that believes they won the election. And people are wondering if some of this is intelligence backed. So what I want to do is, now that the information is out there, and again, if there's more relevant information to add, please put that in the comment section. Please put that in the chat as well. Links are free. But with the idea all out there, I think we got to look at the concept of, let's say, American imperialism through the lens of espionage. And this is one I think about all the time. So again, in a perfect world, I do not want to see some massive military industrial complex. I do not want to see my government going around and just playing fucking Monopoly with every government they don't like around the world and overthrowing governments. But I also don't want to see a world in which we isolate from the world, let anything we want happen, and err on the side of weakness over strength. So it's a very, very weird dance. And I recognize that, you're kind of stuck between a shit and a fart on this. So when I bring in that aforementioned guy from CIA that I mentioned earlier in the fall, this is a topic we're going to get into a bunch, because I want to know, if we look at history, what, let's say, US backed coups were actually truly justified. And if there are some, maybe there are. And then I also want to be able to get to the bottom of the ones that certainly seem like that was a huge mistake or completely unjustified. And of course, you can even think of two wars we fought, Vietnam and Iraq. And as we've talked about in the past, for example, in Iraq, it's not like Saddam wasn't a horrible guy. No one's arguing that. But it is, I think, kind of inarguable that we ended up making Iraq an even worse place and destabilizing the whole Middle East doing that. So you see where the limits of this type of mentality can occur, and the long-term economic, social, and political repercussions that can have on our society, and therefore the Western world as a global power. But there's a story I often think about with this that was on my friend Danny Jones's podcast. It was Danny Jones number 66, I want to say, with this guy named Steven Kinzer. And thank you, Haley, for the $15. I appreciate you. Thank you to everyone who has given anything that I haven't seen while we're here. And thank you for the 180 likes and counting. Let's keep that going. Smash that like button, smash that subscribe button. But Steven Kinzer was a longtime New York Times reporter who was at the middle of the MK Ultra story. And MK Ultra, for those who don't remember, was a CIA mind control mission that they had, especially in the 60s and I think into the 70s, that potentially goes all the way up to like the Charles Manson types. I don't want to go down the whole rabbit hole right now, but essentially this guy's at the middle of a lot of intelligence reporting, and he also had been the bureau chief, I believe, of, was it all of South America for New York Times? I don't know if it was all, check me on that, but he was the bureau chief of like a major country down there, or maybe just South America in general, years and years ago. And this is where a story that he told in Danny Jones podcast number 66 comes up that I think about a lot. So I believe this was the early 80s. It was shortly after Carter had left office and been voted out. He was visiting South America, and Steven Kinzer knew Carter, so agreed to meet up with him and have some drinks. And, you know, I guess he had been out of office maybe a year or two. They start talking, and Kinzer starts to get a little bit like, fuck it. Let me press him on some of this stuff. So he kind of got an autopsy of Carter's presidency. And one of the things he asked Carter is how he prepared to be president right at the beginning, like what it was like to take the reins. And what Carter told him is that when he got into office, he had a meeting, or at least a long phone call, with every single living former president at that point, including Nixon. And he asked them advice on how to legislate, run the country, whatever it may be, represent America around the world, the whole bit, how to be president, essentially. And so Kinzer couldn't help himself and asked who gave the best advice. And to his surprise, Carter said it was Richard Nixon. Kinzer goes, why? And Carter says, well, Nixon came in there and said, and all this bullshit and the legislation and the domestic policy, healthcare, taxes, all that shit that everyone fights over. You're never going to move Congress more than 5%. Those people just fight all fucking day. You don't get anything done, and it's boring. It's for all the people that don't matter out there. He's essentially writing off what the average American cares about. He said, on the other hand, though, foreign policy and making some deals around the world, now that's where you got the real power. And Carter laughed, and Kinzer asked him if he was right about that, and Carter said, absolutely. I think he did. Because essentially what he's saying is, while we're paying attention to a lot of shit here, from a foreign policy perspective, I'm going to take this a step farther. In coordination with intelligence, the president can exert a ridiculous amount of power around the world and shape the rest of world policy long after he leaves, based on alliances that are made, countries that are sanctioned, like we pointed out those 2015 sanctions with Obama that are still heavily affecting the situation today, and then also how that drives home social, economic, and political presence in the United States as well, because these things have reverberating effects. When you do things around the world, it affects all that coming around back in a circle. And I think about that a lot, especially when I see situations like what's happening in Venezuela right now, because that's what we've seen in different directions from every administration. And to an extent, across the Republican and Democratic administrations, we've seen, I'll go back to Reagan, Bush and Clinton, all the way to present day. Even though they may have some different ideas on how it's done, especially when they're out on the campaign trail using their one-liners to talk about their foreign policy, a lot of the end results end up being the same things. A way to protect America's interests around the world, regardless of if it shuts down other countries and sometimes hurts people in those countries economically, and then, you know, what that leads to, violence in the streets, things like that, and you end up with something like Venezuela. So when I have the CIA dude in here in the fall, we'll talk about all that. But that is the state of Venezuela at the moment. I think I just spent like 40 minutes on that. So that feels like enough. Again, if there were some things that were wrong, fill that in. But I want to move on to my favorite governor of all time, Gavin Newsom. So Gavin Newsom, obviously I'm being sarcastic. Gavin Newsom is the guy that with his just presence when he looks at you, well, he's not looking at me, but like when he looks at the interviewer and we see him on camera in an interview and just says something that is blatantly the opposite of what he said the day before, you want to believe the fucking guy. You want to believe him because he's so shameless about it that maybe it's true. It's almost like when Bill Clinton was like, I did not have sex with that woman. I watched that clip and I'm like, no, the fuck you didn't, Bill. You're right. I know you did, but I don't think you did. You know, Newsom has that similar type of thing. He's just not nearly as good of a politician as Bill Clinton was. So, in all his years in power, mayor of San Francisco, I forget what he was. Was he lieutenant governor after that, before he was governor? And then he's been governor for a lot of years. In all his years in power in California, California's homelessness problem has gotten completely out of control. At this point, they account for, I believe, more than 1/3 of the national homeless problem. And it's one state, it's a huge state, but it's one state out of 50. That is certainly a very, very bad number. And during the pandemic, when he was so strong on, keeping people inside, and thank you for 204 likes, everyone. I appreciate that. Keep those likes and subs going. When he was so strong on keeping people inside and ruling with an iron fist and saying we got to be safe and care about everybody and whatever, he allowed all these homeless encampments to get out of control because obviously the pandemic was sending people out of work, bringing homelessness to an all-time high, and creating these tent cities that led to all kinds of people fleeing the state for places that wouldn't allow this, be it Texas, Florida, or Montana. You pick, right? So in those years, Newsom was happy to deny this problem existing, despite the fact that many of his donors in Silicon Valley were also the people leaving, and the ones who were staying, who probably have never voted Republican in their life, were looking at him going, my guy, it's fucked. And he still would act like this was not a problem. I know Joe Rogan has often pointed out that a lot of these cities around the country will have jobs like homelessness coordinator, where they're making deep into six figures and they are effectively incentivized to not work their way out of a job by solving the problem. So it just increases and shit gets out of hand. Now, I believe 2023, I forget what month, maybe someone can put it in the chat or the comments down below. Newsom is going to entertain in San Francisco Xi Jinping, the communist leader of China. And so with Xi coming to America, something really magical happened. And Gavin Newsom decides we're going to clean up the whole fucking streets. So Xi comes in, he's riding in the fucking, motorcade, and he's going through clean streets, not a tent city in sight. And then he leaves, and tent cities, I guess, kind of form back. Maybe my friends from San Francisco can give a little bit of color there in the comment section and in the chat. But now fast forward to 10, 11 days ago, 9 days ago, something like that. Newsom puts in this legislation that he was nice enough to add a tweet to really put the political stamp on it, where he said, no more excuses. We've provided the time. We've provided the funds. Now it's time for locals to do their job. And he subtweeted an Associated Press story from July 25th where it said, breaking, Governor Gavin Newsom has issued an executive order for the removal of homeless encampments in the state. So now he's getting real tough on homelessness and on the people who have, effectively formed these tent cities out of nowhere. And it's really interesting, the timing of this, because we've seen Kamala Harris now become the nominee of the Democratic Party out of nowhere, where inside of 90 days to an election, Kamala Harris, like Gavin Newsom, is a lifelong California legislator and political figure. Kamala Harris was attorney general during the years that this problem was starting to get out of control. She was then a senator during the years the problem continued to get out of control. And so in the build up to the election, things like homelessness, the after effects of the pandemic, the problems at the border, all these things where Kamala Harris was also the border czar, by the way, during 4 years that was not good for the border. All these things are political chips that can be used against her. So naturally, Newsom, being the good Democrat that he is is now trying to clear the way and roll out the red carpet for Kamala to say, look, our streets are clean. What really interests me about this, though, is the way they're doing it. It's sudden. It's completely inhumane. So when you look at this argument, there's always two sides that happen. There's the people who are like, we got to lead with love. We got to let those people who are homeless, we got to let them live there and do their thing because they have nothing else. And we allow it to continue and grow and not foster it because we're not giving them proper help or trying to put some incentives in place for people to not be homeless anymore, which then has the other side attack that side by saying, no, fuck it. We should get them out of the streets. So Newsom for a long time was on this side saying lead with love or just denying the problem altogether. And now because Harris is running for president, time to clean up the streets of San Francisco, he decides to come in and basically bulldoze these people off the street. So let me juxtapose what's happening in San Francisco with what happens here in Hoboken that I see, where I got to say, like, whoever the fuck is doing this local government here, they do a very nice job. In Hoboken, there is a very minor homeless problem, right? There are a few people, usually along Sinatra Drive, sometimes in a couple of the parks. There may be some on the far west side of town. I'm not really sure about that. I'm really never there, but it's very, individual here and there. And so a lot of times, pretty much every day, the only time a day I get to myself is I go and I work out in the morning at the same time. And afterwards, I usually take calls, but it's still like I go for a walk along Sinatra Drive on the Hudson. Beautiful walk, take some of my calls, get my day going. And along that walk, usually there will be about one or two homeless people, depending on the day. And so at one point, for a few weeks in a row, the same homeless woman was putting up a tent encampment right outside of a public building, right on the Hudson. And it was also near like a little park where some kids go and stuff. And I kept watching this for a few days. And then within a month, I suddenly walked up one day and I saw a very calm perimeter. I want to emphasize calm perimeter set by Hoboken PD. I want to give, if we're going to hit the police when they do shit fucked up, we got to give them credit when they do shit right. They've done an amazing job every time I've seen this. They have one officer very calmly with his hands at his side, not on his gun, at a 6-7 foot distance, talk with the woman, stand there while she's packing up her stuff, organized. This can take up to a half hour, 40 minutes. The other officers stand in maybe forming 100-foot radius, 50-foot radius kind of deal. They wait for her to leave. They get her out of there. And then if she finds her way back there 2 weeks later, they do the same thing. This is the humane way to do it. Now, if you want to look at resources for that woman to potentially not be homeless anymore, I'm all ears for that. I don't know what the process is there because she appears to continue to be homeless and other people I see along there continue to be homeless, but you're not going to solve this problem overnight. Either way, that's the right way to do it. Gavin Newsom has basically put in the militant way. They're giving no warnings for these people to be taken out of their homeless encampments. They're not allowed to pack up their shit. There's video of cops just yanking the tents with people still in them off the street and loading it on the trucks. It's like they're trying to do a quick campaign and have gone, from like love everyone to fucking Nazi overnight, like get the fuck off the street so that they can clean this up. I find the whole thing to be full of a horrible stench, as is most things around Gavin Newsom. Guy's got great hair. That's about it. He's the gift that keeps on giving because everything he does is strictly just based on where's the wind going today? That's where we're going to go. And he's just a yes man for his party and for the political establishment, if you will. So, why the people of California keep voting that guy in, can't find a better Democrat or even someone from the other party, the Republican Party, to get in there, I will never understand. But I don't live there. Maybe people in California can fill me in the comments on why he's so popular. Makes no sense to me. Also, very interesting, by the way. It's almost never talked about the fact that his first wife was Kimberly Guilfoyle, who's now Donald Trump Jr.'s fiance. She's like hard MAGA. Newsom's this hard, left like governor guy. you don't see that cross a ton. That's interesting to me. I say that because I wonder if something's going to happen in the build up to this election where, the swords come out and there's a little bit of attacking going on. I love to see some good drama like that. You got to have fun with this thing, this reality TV show we live in. So I don't know, but keep your eyes on that. Moving on. There are riots going on in the UK. Now, I feel like this has been an undercovered story in the US, but, if you remember back in 2016 with Brexit occurring in June 2016, that was a populist movement that was then a harbinger for what happened in the election here in the United States in November 2016. It was essentially like the bellwether, the telltale, like, oh shit, something's happening here. And this is among the West, not necessarily like just within individual countries. When I look at what's happening in the UK, I see some similar type of vibes, not necessarily referring to the election, but referring to political divides and how people are starting to politic some of this stuff. So I don't know. A couple weeks ago, I want to say it was like July 20th, July 21st, there was a stabbing in Southport. It was a total tragedy. 3 little girls in a dance studio were viciously murdered by a 17-year-old who was reported to be a Rwandan immigrant. I don't remember his name, and it was really long. I'm going to fuck it up, so let's not even try to say it. But that turned out to not be true. The guy was born and raised in Cardiff. What the motives are still unclear. He appears to be obviously, a very sick person. He went in and brutally murdered 3 children, and, whatever happens to him can't be bad enough. But this then turned towards the online political movements that are focused on some of the policies that are also things we fight over here in the US, which is immigration policy. So as a result of the UK, perhaps like some other European countries being too lax with migrants coming into the country and illegal immigration, there have been these massive movements that have even then drifted far right to say the opposite. Fuck that. Get out of here. We only want native Britons, which, this gets ugly on all sides. So this has now resulted in, as I said before, an online movement that occurred right after this happened, where a lot of these groups started to use AI generated images to get everyone riled up and angry, to get into the street and basically say, let's stop the immigration stuff and let's go after some of the migrants in the streets, which is never okay to do. Now, are there some migrants that come in among the many migrants, just like we have here, that are straight up, gang members or criminals because they're not vetted and the immigration policy is broken? Absolutely. We have those problems in New York. We have those problems at the migrant centers. We have those problems at the border. Like, we all know this. There are also plenty of people that come in, they're just looking for a better life and they're doing it illegally and they can't be allowed to do this and we got to fix it. But like, you know, that they're not people that are bad people that you want to be throwing bottles at and shit. It's just kind of the ugly part of humanity. But these riots have spread to multiple huge cities around the UK and have fueled some of these complete anti-immigration sentiments. And I think it's a real moment forget the UK for a second. Absolutely, it's a moment for them. But looking at it from a US centric policy standpoint, this is a very good example that our politicians definitely won't use the opportunity to look at, but I wish they would, to see how bad this can start to get if you do not do real legislation that is nuanced, finds some answers in the middle, allows a possibility for people to immigrate in a legal, less legal intensive, like legal system intensive and monetarily and yearly intensive way to get into this country so that we can find a way to, in addition to securing our border, allow normal immigration to happen and be able to vet people that come in rather than just fucking, like Nick Shirley showed when he was here. People unknown walking across the border, usually sponsored by the cartels. I, again, want to plug my upcoming episode with Jorge Ventura that's coming out next week. He's been on both sides of the borders reporting over the last 3.5 years. Amazing stuff. All kinds of bad shit happening. When you see what's happening in the UK, there is not a lot of airway between here and there. And we are going to continue to see also foreign elements pour some gasoline on that fire using the internet, which always happens. We also do it to other people, if we're being fair, or to other countries from the US, but we're going to see those elements pour gasoline on the fire. And even in the build up to what is now, this already crazy contentious election, we could see some serious, serious problems. And I hope, cynically, I don't think it will be the case, but I hope that will not happen. So people should pay attention to this. We also got to be careful not to jump to conclusions on who it is doing this stuff. That said, yes, there is absolutely violence committed by people who are migrants illegally coming into the country. If you've seen the recent Lock and Riley, is that her name? Lock and Riley? I hope I got that right. Case in Georgia, that was a Tren de Aragua guy from Venezuela, I believe. Right? So, yes, those things absolutely do happen. And you don't ever want to see that, but you also got to judge these on an individual basis and hope the information is good. One thing I'm finding all the time that is a Captain Obvious statement is that information on the internet is just so fucking out of control that you got to be real careful when you first see something to make sure it's actually sourced and has not just been run with to be, some trend on Instagram or on Twitter or something like that. So I've been watching these UK riots. I'm going to continue to watch that. I would recommend you guys do too. It's really sad what's happening, and I hope that does calm down and there's some sort of, political legislation that can come out of that to do some good here. But again, who knows? So to close off this week, let's do some Kamala and Trump. The other night, we saw Kamala come out at, what was that, Joint Air Force Base for the prisoner exchange where we got Evan Gersevich, the Wall Street Journal reporter, back from Russia in exchange for some children of former deep Russian spies. So interesting trade. Glad to see Evan home. I guess that's well done. But Kamala comes onto the runway with the president, Joe Biden, who, I mean, my guy is looking more and more lights on, nobody home, if that's even possible. But she's standing next to him, and she's the one making all the commentary on this trade that occurred with Putin. And she also did some regular Kamala word salad where it was like, you know, it's good to have diplomacy because diplomacy is so important for diplomacy around the world. It's something like that. But very interesting to me that even though she is now, she has the delegates, whether you like it or not, she is now the candidate of the Democratic Party and the coming head of it. Pause. She is not the president. And Biden stepped aside as candidate, but he did not step aside as president. And so when I see her taking leadership in situations like this, in my head, I'm going, would you see John McCain take that leadership in 2008 when Bush is still in office? Would you see Hillary Clinton take that leadership in 2016 when Obama's still in office? I don't think so. And I don't know why more people aren't answering that question. Now, in fairness to Joe, there was a video that was, it looks like it was falsely represented, where he went back onto the plane and they said, oh, he thinks he's got to get back onto the plane to leave. But in reality, he was going on to thank and it does appear that way. He was going on to thank the pilots for bringing Gersevich home, which is a nice thing to do. But when he's down on the ground next to Kamala, it appears he has no idea what's going on, and the commentary is minimal. So certainly odd to see that there, but the support that has happened behind Kamala just instantaneously online and the movements to suddenly flip all the polls is a little sketchy. I understand they're like very afraid of another Trump presidency, but I'd like to see some sort of clean race. I just, it's gonna get nasty. It's just how it is. It's absolutely gonna get nasty. And we're now also heading into her picking a VP. And now you've already seen all the potential VP candidates coming out and getting nitty gritty in the race and throwing around a lot of attacks. So we're gonna see that keep picking up. But the story of the week in the campaign, let's not lie here, was the Trump, what was that? The National Black Broadcasters Association or whatever, going out and in front. So the first question by Rachel Scott on stage was, let's be very fair to Trump here. That was everything that's wrong with journalism. That's the only way I can put it. You know, he he sat there and listened to that whole thing where she went off on all these things, some things that might have been fair, other things that were completely out of context, just trying to call him a racist to his face for 2 minutes so that she could get boop, one coin in the virtue signal jar and have herself a day. So it was immediately contentious. But you got to remember, Kamala didn't show up and Trump did. And there's people who are arguing, well, so what room does she have to talk? This is where, though, Trump being careless in the past with words comes back to bite him. It takes away leverage in situations like this because now it's like, well, he has to show up to try to explain himself. That said, should anyone show up and A, have a journalist who is their best friend, or B, have a journalist who just wants to stick a coin in the virtue signal jar and go at them completely combatively to, make a popularity point on social media? No, neither of those things should happen. We need to get to real journalism, and Rachel Scott did not provide that, which is very disappointing. But Trump also got caught in, a kind of funny moment in a way, but also like politically totally careless, where he starts going after Kamala's race and saying like, oh, she was Indian until recently. If you're being fair, the one she's biracial, she always has been. Whether or not she's propped that up in the past is certainly a question. But this is where you get into where Trump is his own worst enemy. It's a total unforced error where he now gets this moment that could be clipped up like crazy, where they can spin it into the whole birtherism thing as well and run campaign ads against him. And it's why during this, I don't know, last week and a half, 2 week period where Kamala's become the candidate, it's why we've seen the race appear to become a little more even. Now, do I think people are going to forget the imagery of Trump at his near assassination? And do I think people are going to forget some of the mistakes, major mistakes of the last few years when they go to the polls? I don't think so. I don't think they forgot that in 2020 coming off of COVID and punished Trump for that. So I kind of see the same type of situation here. And if I were betting, I would assume Trump would win. But like I said earlier, it's going to get dirtier and dirtier. And, the biggest enemy of Trump is going to be himself. We know Kamala is going to make some gaffes and mistakes. She's not necessarily the brightest bulb, but, she's not going to say stuff that is incendiary in many cases like Trump is, because Kamala is just, she's a chameleon. She's much more of a controlled asset, if you will. She's going to do what the popular thing that her party tells her to do is, and that's what you're going to get, which, maybe that would make a Kamala presidency somewhat predictable, which is something you don't get with Trump. But the thing that these two do have in common that I never want to bury the lead with here is you do got to follow the money with them. They're both two sides of the same coin with that, with different issues. On Kamala's side, you saw a big thing this week where Jake Tapper lit up Reid Hoffman, the LinkedIn guy, for all the money he's putting behind Kamala, because he's putting it there because he wants her to fire the FTC chief who is going after major companies and stopping them from basically destroying small businesses and becoming monopolies. And so that's why he's funding her. That's why some of these other big money people are funding her, because she's just going to do what she tells them to do. And then on Trump's side, you see at the end of May, Miriam Adelson, pledges like $100 million to him in exchange for him supporting effectively the annexation of the West Bank by Israel, which, you know, that's not that doesn't appear to be an Israeli government public position right now, but she's a very influential figure who is an Israeli American, and that to me is a war crime. So when I see the money piling into these people from the special interests, cynically, yeah, I go, you'll be able to predict what these presidencies are going to be based on the fucking people who donated to them. The difference is with Trump, you'll get, a bunch of unexpected shit because you never know what he's going to tweet. But I get real concerned about the leadership in this country. I've been concerned for years now, and I'm going to continue to be concerned because I think our options are not great. But obviously, that type of commentary is going to piss everybody off because it's not necessarily positive for either side. That's the way it's always been with me. You guys can say what you want. I'm free to read the comments there. Leave whatever you want about that in the comment section as well as in the chat. But I had said earlier, I want to talk about what's going on this week. I need to give an enormous shout out to my man Marcus from Sweden. This dude sat on a video chat with me from 1 a.m. Sweden time to like 7:45 a.m. Swedish time last night to get the files from the podcast I just recorded 36 hours ago or whatever with Andrew Bustamante, which is going to be dropping on Tuesday or Wednesday this week and is a time sensitive one. It is a fireworks type episode. But when we recorded it, the video files from the first 2 hours, 20 minutes were completely corrupted. And I don't know what the fuck Marcus did, but he uncorrupted the fuck out of them, was working with me through the computer, figuring out how to build some weird software, and we got all of it. So I'm very happy to say that episode is going to be dropping, like I said, on Tuesday or Wednesday. I'm thinking Wednesday because I'm now a day behind and I need to go in tomorrow and probably Tuesday and get all the marketing done for it, the edit done, and all that. So I will see you guys for that one. We are going to get into Diddy. We are going to get into Iran, the greater Middle East, and what's going on with all the Iranian-funded terrorist groups, as well as Israel's role within the war they're seeming to fight on like 3 fronts. We are going to talk about whether or not Andy is a CIA plant, which we talked about very directly. You'll see the podcast also started with some fireworks on that, which was fun and in a very friendly way. And we got into a very intense discussion about UFOs that got to a meta type level that I would have expected to speak on with like a physicist in here. Like Andy's analysis on that was really good. We talked about that for over a half hour. Like all those topics I just mentioned there was a lot there. We talked about China and Taiwan and Andy's predictions there. So all kinds of shit coming. I got a lot of fire guests coming up for you. I have some serious Scientology content, a couple episodes coming. I will leave that there. I'll just cough. Ron is one of those people, but the other person I think you're going to be very surprised at, and they were incredible. I'll just put it that way. So a lot of good stuff. Jorge Ventura, as I said. So if you are not subscribed, please subscribe. Please smash that like button as always. Thank you so much for being here. I will check the comments as they start to come in after the live, and I will check the live stream chat. Stay tuned for the next episode that we do of this. I'm guessing it's going to be next Sunday night, but just be checking your YouTube feed. And when you see me on the YouTube feed, not just my videos, but when you see the post, please be sure to like those and leave a comment. It does help us spread the channel around. We are trying to grow this thing, baby. And before I forget, my boy Tommy G from episode 197 is going to be putting out a documentary at the site of Trump's assassination. And Danny Hall and Andy Bustamante are both there, sent by yours truly, breaking down the entire thing. So stay tuned for that documentary because that shit's going to be crazy. Hit that sub button, hit that like button. I'll see you guys next week. Peace.